Hi everybody, and welcome to week 4 of PHI 208. This week we'll be analyzing the history of philosophy of religion, primarily focusing on the traditional and somewhat contemporary arguments for the existence of God or against the existence of God. And we will also be, one of the discussions this week is also about the Turing test, which is this famous kind of thought experiment, but also it's a real thing that deals with artificial intelligence. So the structure first of this week is to read chapter 4 from the textbook, and you'll also see some recommended resources, articles about the existence of God. It's a little bit lighter week this week. There is just just two discussions and a quiz. One of the discussions is about the existence of God, and the other is the Turing test. So let's talk about a little bit about philosophy and the study of the existence of God, or the relationship between philosophy and the existence of God as it's broadly construed. I know that many people in this course have religious beliefs, and that those beliefs are extremely important to them. And others might have other specific religious beliefs, or beliefs that they don't believe in religion, or they're agnostic, which means they don't know whether or not God exists, or they haven't drawn a conclusion on that question. But it's extremely important to think philosophically about these questions and about the existence of God, and philosophers throughout the history of philosophy have done so. They don't merely say, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, and then moving into Kierkegaard, and moving into, those are some of the famous kind of theological, pretty much everybody, well, not everybody, but most people in the Middle Ages and medieval philosophy, St. Anselm, they all believed in the existence of the Judeo-Christian God, and there are also some medieval Islamic scholars as well, so they would believe in, the Islamic faith, so Allah, even though it appears that Allah is the same God, as from the Hebrew scriptures, it's just that Islam traces its roots back to Ishmael, while Judaism traces it back through Isaac. But anyway, that's another discussion, and I don't have a lot of knowledge about that, so I'm not going to speculate on it. But anyway, all of these philosophers thought, look, we can't just believe in God because the priests tell us, or the pastors tell us, or because our parents tell us. That's not a good reason to believe in the existence of God. But what they did is they thought that they could present proofs that demonstrated that God existed. And then through logical argumentation and philosophical/theological reasoning, they thought they could demonstrate that God in fact did exist. And then once you demonstrate that God exists, then you attempt to demonstrate the attributes of that God, and then you attempt to align the attributes with the way that reality is and with the way that humans are, in the hope that you can learn more about what God wants you to know about reality. So often in medieval times, the discussions would start, the books that these philosophers wrote would start with kind of a prayer to God. And many would say things like, God, I hope that you will, clear my mind's eye, clear my mind, keep me from writing falsehoods, prevent evil from coming in and kind of taking over my pen, guard me so that I write the truth that you want all humans to know. And then they would delve into their philosophical analyses. Now, at the same time, because people were forced to believe in God basically throughout history, forced upon fear of death, the people who were actually agnostic or atheists would often take on a certain guise as being religious or as holding strong Christian beliefs. But then as you read their analyses and their philosophical argumentation, you can see that they're questioning the existence of God in very subtle ways, or sometimes they use very dense language because, again, in those times, just as in our times, your average person might not be able to, or your average political or religious leader might not be able to understand the dense philosophical arguments. And so you could make your arguments kind of hidden away inside this larger book. And just back then, just like today, people start to open the book to make sure that it's acceptable for consumption by people at large, and they get 12 pages into these philosophical analyses, and they're like, okay, yeah, this book seems okay. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It seems to be okay. Or maybe they rely on some other scholars to determine whether or not it's acceptable. And back then, acceptable meant anything that went against God or questioned God was thrown away or cast away, and the person was in danger of their life in some instances. At the very least, their book could be banned and burned, and we say, oh, burning books, like they do that now. But back then, when people wrote books, they wrote one book, and sometimes they would have, a scribe copy that book, so there might be 2 or 3 copies if you were lucky. So when you hand your book over, you're handing everything over, right? You don't have it backed up on your little hard drive. You don't have it anywhere else. It's in your hands, and you've worked on it for years and years, and you hand it over to the authorities, and you're saying, like, okay, please review my book, and then if they don't like it, they can torch it. There was a famous Russian author. I think he wrote a book called Ride the Tiger, or there might be a different... But anyway, this guy was like insane in the genius way, and he writes this book, and then he burns it himself, right? Because he just thought it was garbage, which it wasn't garbage. Dead Souls, Gogol. Maybe it was Nikolai Gogol. But anyway, he writes this book, and he hates it, and he's spent years and years writing it, and he burns it. And then he rewrites it, and I think he burned a portion of his rewrite. And then finally, I think what we have now is like eight sections of this book that he wrote called Dead Souls, which kind of led into Dostoevsky and that kind of Russian literature style where they explain in detail all of these minute relationships that occur within Russian society, and you have these guys getting really angry at each other about things, and you're like, why do they want to kill each other in the square? I mean, the guy just tapped the other guy on the shoulder. I don't really understand why they want to kill each other. But anyway, so as you can see about God's existence. Anyway, I always like those stories. Sorry, I'm going on a digression here, but it lets you know that I'm a human being. I love artists that destroy their own work because they think it's horrible. I think there's something pure about that. I think a lot of people, myself included, try to produce things for their own benefit or gain economically or socially. And to work at something and to love it and to destroy it indicates that you're kind of beyond, the economic social gain in relation to your creation. Or perhaps it's just out of fear that your work will be rejected, which if you read the introduction to Dead Souls, I can't really tell if Gogol's being sarcastic or if he's being realistic, but he seemed to care intensely about critique, and he indicates that he wants critique of this work, but perhaps he was just trying to convince himself against that part of the artist that when they are critiqued just screams out for to kill the critiquer, right, or to reject the critique. Anyway, I digress. But this week, so what philosophers do or have done in the past is attempt to find arguments that either support the existence of God or go against it. So one of the most famous arguments against the existence of God involves the problem of evil, and you've probably thought of it on your own, perhaps, or heard it at some point. If God, the Judeo-Christian God, is considered to be omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, and all good, omnibenevolent. So if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good, then evil should not exist. But in our world, it appears that evil does exist. Therefore, God is either not all-knowing, all-powerful, or all good. So God could be missing one of those attributes. God is all-knowing and all-powerful, but not all good, then God creates evil. If God is all good and all-knowing, but not all-powerful, it could be the case that God knows what's going to happen, and God intends the best things to happen, but because God is not all-powerful, God can't make those things happen. So that's one of the strongest arguments against the existence of God, a world, or at least against the existence of a God that is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all good. Now, if you believe that God, For example, in some religions, there are gods or a god that has kind of a negative, what most of us would consider a negative component or a violent or destructive behavior, like Shiva in Hinduism. Now, if your religion includes that aspect of God, then of course it's pretty easy for you to believe that bad things happen on earth, both because of human action, but also there could be these negative gods. And you do have that in a certain sense in Christianity. You have these angels, right? The story of Lucifer, who becomes the devil or Satan. And somehow this angel convinced a third of the other angels to, like, hey, we're going to overtake God, we're going to take heaven, kick God out of heaven. And then God's like, no, you're not. That's not going to work. And so the angels that aligned with Lucifer have been cast onto earth. We call them demons. And demons go around, and in a certain sense, they are gods, right? They are, with a lowercase g, I guess, but they're more powerful than humans. They can transcend space and time in ways that we can't. And they want to destroy us, according to certain people in Christian doctrine. Now, just because a dominant view exists doesn't mean that that is the only view. Some people don't believe in angels at all, or that there is like a Satan. My friend here, actually was preaching on the fact once that he doesn't believe that Satan exists, and this was in a Christian church. Satan, in fact, is the conditions of society and human action that lead to negative outcomes, and the way it's been personified in historical religious texts is as this kind of evil entity that kind of forces humans to do things. But really, Satan exists in all of us. We cause suffering and death and pain and destruction, and then we transpose that onto some figure that actually, in fact, doesn't exist. And again, let's just go with this philosophical analysis, right? If you're an angel and you're with God and God created you, how could it be logically that you could think that you could destroy the thing that created you? It's almost like Pinocchio, thinking that he can destroy, what was it, Geppetto, I think was his creator's name. Now, perhaps Pinocchio could, I guess. I guess if I made Chucky could kill me, right? But it seems strange that if you had direct access to God, to this being that is beyond space and time, that according to Christian doctrine is omnipresent, it's omnipotent, and you knew that thing, and I use thing in the most respectful sense here. I don't believe that God is a man or a woman. Often God is gendered in religious texts, usually toward the he. But of course, God is not a man. I mean, if God exists, it's something far beyond humanity. But anyway, how could it be that you, as an angel, would think, okay, I'm going to overtake this huge entity, source of being that created me? I mean, it doesn't make logical sense. It would seem that you would know intuitively that there would be no way that you could destroy or overcome that entity. Unless, of course, there were conditions set up in which you felt like you could bend the rules or something and get away with it. But anyway, that's a whole nother issue. But again, that's the way that philosophers tend to think about these issues. We can't merely just accept the fact that our priest or pastor or parents, the 3 Ps, right, tell us that God exists, therefore God exists. We need to make sure that we analyze these things based on philosophical argumentation and logical analysis. Now, we might find that we don't actually get to an answer to this question, and scholars on both sides fall into different categories. Some scholars, whether atheist or theist, believe that the atheist position is the starting point, precisely because we don't see God directly or have any way to measure that God actually exists. And it seems that the earth is this tiny little orb in the middle of vast, empty nothingness, such a vast space, such a random occurrence for life to occur here, that they believe that atheism is the natural starting point. Now, some of those people then attempt to move from that initial atheism to a theism. Others believe that human intuition of some sort of God, or they believe that there could be some explanations or arguments to be made for the world. For example, Aquinas, the 5 ways that he argues. Aquinas says that everything has a source. Everything has a cause. And so, the cause of Justin is my parents, and my parents' cause was their parents. And the cause of this plant was the seed, and the seed was caused by this plant's parent. And the cause of Star Wars is George Lucas, or the person who wrote the Star Wars books, and then it was adapted. And so everything goes back in a cycle. But you can't go back forever, because there must be some cause that is the beginning. And because an uncaused cause, or for Aristotle, an unmoved mover. So if we continue to go back in time, we have a cause for this, a cause for that, a cause for that. There has to be something that is uncaused, because if it were caused, then that cause would be the ultimate cause. But if that ultimate cause were then caused by something else, therefore there must be a first cause. That first cause, Aquinas believes, is God. Now, again, that doesn't tell us anything about the attributes of God. It only tells us that God perhaps exists. And of course, Aquinas draws the conclusion that God does in fact exist, and then in the Summa and his extensive other works, he outlines the attributes of God, the attributes of the devil, the attributes of the world, the attributes of everything, and then he explains how they all align with Christian doctrine, mixed in with Aristotle, and then the world makes sense again. Anyway, okay, so giving you a little taste of thinking philosophically about the philosophy of religion. So let's avoid answers like, I believe God exists because my parents told me so. Let's avoid answers that make claims about God based on a specific religion, because again, in philosophy, we're just focused on the starting point here, and in this week, we're focused on whether or not God exists. Now, if we can prove that God exists, then we can start talking about God's attributes. But merely proving that God exists doesn't prove anything about God's attributes. Now, if God does exist, and we look at the universe and how amazingly humongous the universe is, and about all the planets and space and energy that exist within this universe, then we can probably say that God is quite powerful to be able to create this vast universe, a universe that is apparently still expanding from a central point, which means that there is an edge to our universe. Well, depending on how you view it, I guess I still don't understand the explanations from physics. They explain it like a balloon, like you're blowing up a balloon. And so everything on the surface of the balloon is our universe, and so it's all expanding, getting further apart because the balloon is expanding. But like, what's inside the balloon? I don't understand that. And then what's on the edge of the balloon? I don't know. So the balloon is expanding, or is it that the edge of the universe is pushing itself out into non-being and creating being? So if the edge of the universe is creating more space and engaging whatever's not on the edge, and overtaking it, then perhaps the edge of the universe is actually creating being. And then that line would be the line between all the rules that govern our universe and then absolute nothingness. Think about that for a second. Well, we can't think of absolute nothingness, because the minute that you try to think of absolute nothingness, you can't think outside of space. So you can think of blackness, black emptiness, right? Nothing, but you're still thinking of something because space still exists. And then the fact that you're thinking about something indicates that there's something else that still exists, and so it's impossible for humans to think of nothing. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Let's have a good week and continue our analysis of these themes through philosophical reasoning, and to continue to try to hone our positions in relation to what we believe, providing evidence and reasoning for our beliefs, strengthening them, or perhaps changing them based on the evidence.